name's Reeves Taylor. We're going to shift from water to energy, because the rest of the afternoon, our big chunk is going to be talking about that energy transition that my good friend Bobby Tudor talked about last night. This is going to be a round robin talking about lessons learned in two cities, LA and Houston, with great N-Rail partnership, as you'll see in a minute from Jacqueline. I think the context very quickly, very briefly, it was just the Paris Climate Action, COP21, 2015, that the world suddenly recognized that the built environment was the story around this decarbonization focus. And let's also be clear, water and energy here in Texas are very tightly tied together. If we don't have water, we can't generate power. And by the way, if we don't have power, we can't move water. So this is a natural transition. But this idea of using less energy, and in the built environment, as we talked post-COP21, it's really electricity. Using less energy, often combusted fossil fuel, is the city, or my world at Gensler, and individual projects' carbon footprint. Carbon, as we might argue in politically charged times, is one of the big impacts on climate change. So energy, carbon, climate, which I hope to most of you all, you make the connection, but I always have to do that. But the big aha was how big the built environment, its design, its construction, its operations, the stuff that we make the built environment from is right up there with ag, transportation, industry as one of the big impacts. Arguably, as we build, we should build for a very long time and reuse, reposition what we have rather than build new. My world is individual projects, partnering with Gavin at the end, who is with HARC, one of our projects. But when we talk to the city scale, it's this complex conversation we're going to have today. I'm going to have each of my colleagues kind of dive into not only who they are and the amazing talent they represent, similar to what you've heard so far today, but talk about their particular cities' targeting of how to decarbonize primarily the operational, the energy side of their world, in light of the promises that many mayors made post, say, some national politics in the last few years, that cities wanted to become that net zero carbon focus in a time frame over the potentially next 20 years or faster. And with that, I'll start with Lauren, who'll talk about the LA 100 and its collaborative approach.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'm not sure if it's on yet, but I'll just keep talking until it turns on. So while it's turning on, I do want to thank Duke and the whole ASU and Tenacross team. I know this, not only for including this panel and this discussion, but also your investment in Los Angeles. And I know this particular summit has been a long time coming. It was a game of sort of hurry up and wait throughout the pandemic. And I'm really glad we all stuck with it and you were able to make it happen here in Houston. It's a really fantastic way to kick off 2023. Already these discussions have been so invigorating and enlightening and thought-provoking and discussion-provoking. So hopefully we'll live up to that as well, but thank you so much. So I'm Lauren Faber-O'Connor. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Los Angeles, and I joined the mayor's office in 2015. I'm a born and raised Angelina. I grew up in West Hollywood, Hollywood Hills, downtown, West LA, East LA, all the areas that I now serve. But growing up, I never thought I would live and work and settle in Los Angeles. I left as soon as I could because I was very, very interested, most likely because of my upbringing, in these issues of air pollution, public health, really seeing what was going on in my communities, and thought that the ways to solve those problems were not going to be homegrown in Los Angeles. So I'd conditioned my family that I was not coming back, and really have just been overwhelmingly excited and proud of the work that has transpired in Los Angeles over the last 1 to 2 decades, maybe a decade and a half, that's really fostered a new ethic around the clean energy economy and the role of Los Angeles as economically diverse as it is. We are founded on oil. We are an oil town at its founding, and really trying to grapple with that legacy with the opportunity that we have as a city second largest in the country. We own and operate the largest municipal electric and water utility in the country, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, which had as a legacy has been one of the last to be able to divest from coal in the state of California. We also own and operate the airport system in Los Angeles, LAX and Van Nuys. We own and operate the Port of Los Angeles, the busiest, together with Long Beach. It's the busiest port complex in the Western Hemisphere. And so these are incredible economic influencers nationally and beyond. But they're also major responsibility when it comes to acting sustainably, responsibly, and focusing equity in our operations. So I was just so proud to be able to come back to Los Angeles and work for then Mayor Eric Garcetti, who has now been succeeded by Mayor Karen Bass, who came to Los Angeles, back home to Los Angeles as former Congresswoman Bass, just at the end of last month. And to, really continue that legacy that he put forward around a clean energy economy. We put forward the first ever sustainable city plan for the city back in 2015. And that was a really interesting time. I joined right after that was released, and so much had transpired just over the course of that year. And we knew that we were setting very aggressive goals for Los Angeles power system, which if we are going to transform transportation, our buildings, it's just an increasing load and responsibility on the electricity system to take up the role that natural gas has played and to take up the role that gasoline has played and diesel and other petrochemical end uses. It's a really important piece that we have to think very critically about how do we enable that transition. And every year that we have set goals, we've increased the goals basically every single year because of what's going on around us, constantly bombarded by a new challenge, a new disaster, or a new opportunity as technology is changing, as the political winds are changing, as funding is becoming more available. But so if you take us back to 2015, one of the big kind of pivot moments that I think really influenced the zeitgeist of Angelenos. We had already had very significant 60% renewable energy goals by 2035, 2040, getting to carbon neutral by 2050. Those were in place. But by the late fall of 2015, LA experienced what ended up becoming the largest natural gas methane leak in United States history at the Aliso Canyon natural gas storage facility just outside the city boundary, but alongside a neighboring community in Los Angeles. This was an incredibly harmful blowout that lasted half a year almost, through Thanksgiving, through Christmas, through New Year's, where thousands of families were displaced because of that incident. And it really woke up people in an entirely new way, communities that weren't even part of the affected community, thinking about the vulnerabilities of the system that it was supporting. And it also really had an impact on our own operations because the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power is a customer of the gas utility that was suffering from this incident. And so we were worried about our own reliability concerns and the availability of natural gas through the winter and what that would mean for our maintenance opportunities during that time when electricity usually goes down to do maintenance in the winter time and all the flows of an interconnected energy system. So this is when we said we have to figure out if and how to get to a 100% zero carbon energy system for Los Angeles. LADWP, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, is what's known as vertically integrated. So we run the operations of the electricity generation, the delivery to customers, and we also operate the grid 24/7, separate from the rest of the state of California. So huge opportunity to prove that it can be done. But we knew we couldn't prove it on our own, and so I was ecstatic when I went to NREL to see if they would be a part of this effort. And I'll leave it to Jacqueline to really tell the story of what we were able to achieve. But we asked a lot of NREL and the DOE. We asked them to not only show us the way, but to engage Angelenos on a regular basis throughout the process, to tell us what the environmental justice impacts were, to work with other partners in Los Angeles, to help us understand what the air quality impacts are, the jobs impacts, and other economic impacts, in addition to, can it be done affordably and reliably? And that's really the beginning of the story of LA 100.
Great. Jacqueline, continue the story.
Sure. I'm Jacqueline Cochran, and I direct our Grid Planning and Analysis Center at NREL, and I led the LA 100 study. And at the time, no one had really dug into reliability questions on, can a 100% renewable energy system stay reliable under all kinds of conditions, in terms of heat waves and floods like we have today and so forth. And also, this was new for NREL in trying to weave in changes across the economy. So what are, as vehicles get electrified, as the metro gets electrified, as some of the buses get electrified, school buses, hey, if we have a bunch of school buses, would they be good for responsive demand for, if there's a shortfall? The mayor has very aggressive goals in terms of electrifying homes. So if you took out your gas dryer and replaced it with an electric one, or your gas stove, right? All of these questions start coming together. So the last session was on data. Whew, this was a really data-heavy study, because we were taking things because it wasn't just a power question. It was really transportation, housing, and we were doing this in a way that was, there's no one way to get to 100% renewable energy reliably. So it's not a question of NREL coming in and saying, okay, how do we do it? It's really listening to the community members. What's going to be important to them in the decision making on how to get to 100% renewable? And so that's where we were listening to. There is not a common vision of what it means to be 100%. So there are folks who want to go almost all the way, but make use of some of the existing gas infrastructure that's in the city. There are folks who really want to see this all local to the city and not build out across, the solar and wind in areas that might be cheaper to build, but it's outside the city. There are folks who would like in the city, but don't want it to have any combustion. So hydrogen is a fuel that we could use and store, but if there are folks who don't want that as part of the solution, right? So there is not one idea, common idea. And so one of the roles of NREL was to help walk through trade-offs, right? Because NREL doesn't have skin in the game in terms of the future of power and energy and life in Los Angeles. But what we could do is we could help answer questions. We use the data, we use the supercomputers at NREL, and we can do our checks to make sure any solution that we offer, I shouldn't say solution we offer, what we're doing is we're looking at different scenarios, different types of futures based on how you define what's renewable, what is important to capture in the study. And what we can do is we can then answer questions people had. Hey, is this going to help my kid's asthma? Hey, is this going, how does this compare to the heavy duty trucks that are running through my neighborhood? I mean, we can tease out some of the questions. Sometimes there are misperceptions about what we can do or not, and those are the things that we could help answer. But always fundamentally, this was for the community to then use to help make decisions. So we were never providing like a recommendation or a solution. It was really, okay, this option has these advantages over this one, but always addressing the questions that are driving this, which were not power, right? A lot of folks, they have ideas about what that future is. And, some people, it's like, I really want a clean energy future, but I don't want it to be on the backs of the neighborhoods located next to the combustion turbines that's there for reliability purposes. So hearing these voices was really important in how we structured the study.
So before we jump to Gavin, I want to have you clarify something. Pretty clear, I represent the private realm. Here's the public realm. We have analogous, amazing people who work with a mayor, work with a city, public official. NRail. This 1 minute, what is NRail?
Yeah, NRail is
let
a
people know.
research laboratory.
Yeah.
So we do, a lot of research on, upfront R&D. So, how can we have the power grid operate with lots of wind and solar? How can you reduce costs of wind and solar? If we have heat pumps instead of furnaces in homes, how do we have the heat pumps work more efficiently and so forth? So we do a lot of research about our energy system.
And she's a national resource.
And Jacqueline's being modest
Yeah.
because, you are really representing the preeminent research laboratory on renewable energy for the United States government. And we knew that it's one thing, the answer is one thing coming from us, coming from our utility. We really wanted to make sure that we brought in folks who were sort of disinterested in a way in the final answers or set of options, but really coming from an incredibly kind of robust validator and truth teller and, arbiter of these debates because of the amount of analysis and real world experience where they're actually testing real technology on their campuses. And it was just an incredible resource and ability for us to speak very confidently in the decisions that we were going to make, which ultimately I buried the lead. We ended up accelerating our zero carbon grid goal, which before the process started, before the LA 100 study was underway, it was 2045, and we accelerated it by 10 years, so 2035.
So I wanted this as a leverage point to our local story. Now, our local city partner is unable to join us today. Instead, we asked Gavin from HARC, who is kind of our local, I won't say NRail, but local guru of thinking around all manners of things, including the energy and decarbonization story for Houston. So with that, Gavin, you want to introduce yourself and HARC?
Sure.
And what the Houston story is.
Absolutely. So thank you. I am pinch hitting here today for Priya Zachariah, who's the Director of Sustainability and Resilience for the City of Houston. And so I guess I'll start with what's HARC. HARC is a research institute, been around now for about 40 years or so, working on air, energy, and water, as well as climate resilience type activities. I lead our energy program, energy and air quality program, which focuses both on decarbonization of energy systems as well as resilience of our energy systems. And I believe in the previous panel there was a discussion about when water modeling is being done into the future as far as potential impacts related to it, that the water modelers, at least at the state level, have not been using climate data. It's the same thing on the energy sector side of things. And so what we're really trying to focus on is we need to decarbonize our energy systems, but we also need to understand what the potential extreme weather and climate risk looks like associated with that. And when you really look at kind of the state of the Texas grid, which we know have had some questions, especially after Winter Storm Uri, and you project out to see how much thermoelectric power, how much water dependent power systems are still going to be on the grid near and midterm. It's really interesting to kind of see what those water implications are. And so we're seeing actually systems along the Brazos River, the Trinity River, that are seeing significant reductions in their actual value and ability to generate electricity, which needs to be taken into account by our regulators and such. And so that went down a whole other rabbit hole. But that's just important for us, it's important to look at both the decarbonization side of things as well as resilience. You can't look at them in two separate pieces because there's very much interconnectedness associated with that. I've been working with the city of Houston now, so I guess I've been in Houston now for about 20 years, but I've been working in some regard with the city of Houston through 3 different mayoral administrations, both within the city of Houston as well as a consultant or as through HARC and through some of our research initiatives. And so I've seen kind of the evolution of what's happened within the city from the White administration through the Parker, through the Turner administration, and really seeing a common interest there of the city trying to be a leading by example type, taking that type of approach. When we were developing the climate action plan for the city of Houston, which we're much very excited to have that climate action plan developed. But after listening to what Los Angeles has done and several other large cities have done, the city of Houston still has a lot to do to kind of mature in this space and make sure that we continue to build out this area. One of the things we hear about when we do the climate action plan is what was happening in Los Angeles. Why don't you guys adopt what happened in LA? Or why don't you adopt what happened in New York or Boston or Chicago? And what we found as we were developing the climate action plan is people want it to be Houstonized. They want it to be Texanized. They don't want these other ideas coming in necessarily. And so that was a very significant balancing act we had to do. There are some really great ideas, best practices, lessons learned that are happening all over the country that could very much help the city of Houston reach its decarbonization goals of being carbon neutral by 2050. But it had to be specifically developed in a way in which it was did not increase the ire of a lot of those that are maybe not completely bought into the potential climate impacts that are happening there. And so that was very much something we were having to have continued discussions across public sector, private sector, stakeholders to make sure that this balance was happening, that we were developing a plan that had best practices, but was built in a way that had a lot more market mechanisms, incentives associated, very regulatory light type things associated with it. Because one of the primary concerns is whether or not we get this passed, of course, through city council. And if it was too regulation heavy, there was concern first of all, that city of Houston would not pass it. And second of all, that the state would see that heavy regulatory type, heavy-handed type climate action plan and essentially start kind of pushing down on cities to taking
There's also
those
quite a different government structure, the strong LA mayor versus a different kind of mayor in Houston with a stronger council. I mean, there's a whole lot of things you're dealing with that the politics of California
it's completely different
Yeah.
in that regard. And also, if we want to talk about differences, is we don't own a utility, a power utility. We're a deregulated market. There's 65 retail electricity providers out there that you can choose to buy your electricity from. And so the city of Houston has a very little bit of regulatory control over CenterPoint, which is our transmission distribution utility, or any of the generators that are out there, and what kind of products they provide. And so that one was an additional conversation we had to have in order to see, how is the overall ERCOT market going to be developing in order to reduce the amount of emissions that are on the overall grid. Fortunately, solar and wind are much more cost competitive than they were just a few years ago, and you're seeing a significant deployment of solar and wind and storage coming into the Texas market, which significantly helps the city of Houston meeting some of its energy transition goals there, but the city of Houston has very little control in that regard to be able to do it. And so it had to be a lot more focused on what can we do as far as individual organizations, companies, both in the private and public sector, to drive them to take the appropriate steps, but in a way that feels like they have that ownership and that they see the market benefit and the overall co-benefits associated with that. And that was also a significant part of our discussions was around co-benefits. What are the air quality benefits? What are just the potential other quality of life improvements that can happen? And because once again, we're dealing with the public, or especially in the private sector, that was maybe a little more reluctant as far as willingness to kind of buy into this climate action plan. So what are the additional things that I get out of this by participating and actively being involved in the development of this plan here? I don't know.
So,
that's plenty for
we want a little bit
now.
of back and
Yeah.
forth. So I'm going to actually start with the 800-pound gorilla, which has been kind of consistent throughout the morning and the afternoon about the equity issue. The issue of, to be honest, it's a white upper class focus on decarbonization when many of the houses don't even have power, don't have water, or as you say, Jackson, Mississippi, earlier conversation. It was one of the hiccups when I was part of the climate action plan for, Mayor Parker's. We forgot the equity, or the equity quotient was not as clear as many of our constituents in a majority minority city that we are. Can we talk a bit about this decarbonization in light of the diversity that are both of our and all of our I-10 cities? Just kind of a back and forth. How are you addressing this conversation of it needs to be equitable, recognizing the diversity of our communities?
Sure. Thank you for raising it. You know, when we developed both the first sustainable city plan and then the mayor, so we have to update it every 4 years because things change very, very quickly. And also that includes the, our improvements in engaging communities that have otherwise not been able to access government, or we haven't been good about going to communities as well. And that's certainly one of the shifts, I would say, even over a handful of years. And so in 2019, we released LA's Green New Deal, which really had a renewed, dedicated focus on equity through the lens of everything: energy, water, transportation, resilience, housing, and mobility. And that meant, very community-specific programs. And then when it comes to LA 100 that we're talking about here, so we were able to determine that the movement to the transition to 100% renewable energy grid is achievable, affordable, and reliable, and we can do it by 2035. Great. Okay, so we're going to do it. But we have to make sure that that transition is done equitably and prioritizes communities and customers, households that we want to make sure don't have a disproportionate burden on that transition, whether that's rates or the placement of assets or lack thereof, how programs and incentives reach people or don't. And so the next step was actually launching what's called the LA 100 equity strategies. And NREL remains a key leader and partner with us in the LA 100 equity strategies. And that's also a LADWP led. The board is very, very engaged on this. And it includes a steering committee of environmental justice leaders in Los Angeles, and that they, like the advisory group of the original LA 100 process, are really steering the contours of what needs to be studied, but with the goal of, if we're going to develop new solar programs, if we're going to develop building decarbonization programs, how are they tailored to not only make sure we don't do harm in terms of concerns around displacement, energy burden, but also how do we tailor programs to actually reach into these communities first and foremost. So that's the process that we're undergoing right now, while we're also doing the technical work around implementing LA 100.
And I know, Gavin, we'll jump to NREL because I think there's a 800 mile view looking down on the big picture of how we're handling it. But let's go to Houston real quickly, because there was a bit of recovery that I know Hark was part of that, working with our new leaders to really identify maybe lessons from LA, but what perspective might you have with the Houston challenge with that? And then real quickly, because we are running out of time before questions, the NREL perspective, stepping back, how do we look at research to address that better? But Gavin, the Houston POV?
Yeah, so I'll just give an example for the energy transition or decarbonization side of things. There's a definite interest here to lessen the green divide, to make sure that everyone has equal access to solar storage, et cetera, for their houses or homes. And we actually had a project with the City of Houston, working with the City of Houston through the Department of Energy. It was the Solar Energy Technology Office called Power, and it was the project we called it was Powered for Good. And the desire here was, okay, here's some funding, let's figure out a model to do solar plus storage at these households. And through a co-creation process, which is key for when you're doing any type of equity work, you have to engage the community from the very beginning, and they have to be part of the research, the design, the implementation, the whole piece of this, instead of essentially going in and saying, hey, this is a great idea, don't you want to implement it? Instead, it needs to be from the very beginning. It has to have this co-creation process. But so we went in there and said, okay, so we have this funding, we're thinking about solar plus storage, what do you guys think about it? And they're like, we do not care about solar plus storage. We are paying 14 cents per kilowatt hour for our electricity bills, while the rest of the state's paying about 10 cents. And so there's a significant divide as far as what lower income populations are paying versus just kind of the general population and energy prices through their variety of retail electricity providers. And their concern was, we need to understand how to choose the right contract so we're not paying as much extra as we're paying. And so a lot of the work with these communities was actually helping them understand the energy facts label and helping them understand and pick the right contract that they can use to choose that right electricity product to lower the cost. And as we were doing that, we continued to talk with them about solar and storage and what's possible. And we actually worked in developing a pilot called Energy Well Texas, which Catherine Flowers, I saw earlier here, there she is, was one of the founders of that. And that was developing a retail electricity product that lowered electricity prices for using 100% renewable energy product, lowered electricity prices, and added a resilience component. So we actually added a solar plus storage component. It's called micro solar plus storage, which is these small, what we were using were these Jackery systems, which are 1,000-watt generators with a 70-watt panel that you could actually bundle into a 3-year contract with this population, paying lower costs than they were for just brown power, essentially. And so we piloted that effort. And so we were able to essentially meet them where they are by engaging with them very early on in the process and saying, what exactly do you need and how do we help each other get to that point?
And you mentioned some technology, Jacqueline. What are you seeing to address, that green, I won't say apartheid, but we've heard that phrase used before, the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah, it's part technology, part not. I mean, one tangible example from LA 100 is one of the ways that that rates were able to stay, I would say, reasonable in the transition to 100% clean energy is you're electrifying a lot of stuff at the same time in the study, right? So you're just spreading those costs over a lot more demand. And so that helps keep the rates down. The second way you can keep the rates down is having a lot more solar generation because that's one of the least cost technologies. So let's put these two together. We have a lot of new electric vehicle charging that's coming on. In our study we're looking, okay, we have all this new electric vehicle charging. It would be fantastic if they could charge in the middle of the day where their workplaces are, and that's when it's cheapest to serve the load because that can make a huge difference in the cost. But what happens to the folks who don't have a lot of flexibility and where they might be able to do their electric vehicle charging, what type of job that is, right? We could still imagine a future with a lot of electric vehicles and a lot of vehicle charging, but what are the policies or the rate incentives that are needed so that you encourage that daytime charging, but not at the expense of folks who aren't able to have flexibility? When we think about technologies, I was talking at lunch with Lauren about, heat pumps is a fantastic way to lower costs in terms of heating and cooling, water heating, and so forth. A lot of the early research, though, on this is done in an optimized room, right? It's got no leaks and stuff like that. Same with storage as part of battery storage. When you're in a home with a lot more air leakage and you're having these larger temperature swings, are these technologies operating the way we're expecting them to? Because, we're trying to get cost estimates of the impact of doing all this electrification so that you can make the appropriate policies to go along with it to not increase equity. But what if these technologies aren't even working the way it is? So that's part of the responsibility of my colleagues at NREL is to make sure these technologies, the research that's going into these technologies, that we're capturing early in the process the different types of environments and users and not just the ideal.
And basic weatherization is near and dear to many of us here in Houston, since many of the houses don't even have insulation, much less quality windows. So thank you, panel, and thank you again for your questions. Thank you.